and I'm so happy to be here.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oops. Sorry about that. All right, and then we're going, thank you, Marie. And then Liz Lagane, can you please introduce yourself?
Sangait la Uthlang. The day is getting good. Kanishchish Hawa for inviting me to be here for this time together. Sarssa, if I'm saying
Sarssa?
Sarssa, Kanishchish time and specifically on this topic of blood quantum. I'm Tlingit and Haida. I come from Kwan. I'm on my Haida side. I am Eagle, Chichkitne. Our crest is the hummingbird. And on my Tlingit side, I am Kach Adi, freshwater Merksakai salmon. Those are the people I belong to. It's an honor to be here with all of you.
Boyana, thank you. And then I'll move it to Crystal Nixon Luckhurst.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Crystal Nixon Luckhurst. I live in Dillingham. I am the granddaughter of the late Elma and Henry Roll and Gloria Chase of Anvik, and my parents are the late Jimmy Nixon and Charlotte Nixon. And I'm also a mom of 5 wonderful, beautiful children, and I'm very happy to be here, and thank you all for attending.
Boyana, thank you for that introduction. So we're going to move on to our land acknowledgement. We want to ground this session with a land acknowledgement from our board president, Marie Paul. And so I'll give it to Marie to do the land acknowledgement. Boyana.
Waka. Goyana to each one of you for coming to our Sarssa session on blood quantum. Before we jump in here and get started, we would like to begin the Sarssa time with a land acknowledgement. We thank the Alutik, Sukhbiak, Dinaina, Tanena, and the Yupik people of Bristol Bay. We would like to recognize the Dina Ina of the Eklutna and Knik tribes whose lands BBNC Education Foundation resides on in what we now know as Anchorage. The Education Foundation recognizes the thousands of years of stewardship and acknowledges the people of our region and Anchorage as they continue to be the caretakers of the land. Oyana.
Thank you, Marie. Alrighty, well, thank you guys again for coming, and thank you for that land acknowledgement. Let's get into the discussion here. So we are going to move into our discussion. Marie, Lagane, Crystal, please feel free to answer these questions as best as you can. And let's, have good dialogue, and I'm really excited, so thank you. So my first question is, why was blood quantum implemented in the United States and Alaska? And whoever, wants to answer can go first. I can repeat the question. Why was blood quantum implemented in the United States and Alaska? Or what's the background or kind of the history around blood quantum?
This is Lagunai, and if our elder Marie is comfortable and okay with it, I'm happy to share my thoughts, but I don't want to speak before her.
Please do.
Okay. The tool that blood quantum is has been around for a very, very long time in terms of the relationship the United States has had with the Native people of this country. And it is a tool that has been utilized to, I guess, just on a kind of a general way of thinking about it, is a tool by which they can control the relationship they have to Indigenous people, a way to quote unquote define for itself, the United States, and of course, Alaska, who they have a trust responsibility to. So on its face, that is probably one of the things that people are most familiar with, is that there's that relationship that we as Native people have with the United States, and blood quantum has been a way in which the United States can control who it has a relationship with. And of course, that has also passed on to us here in Alaska. I would say, though, that my own personal understanding of it is much deeper than that, in terms of the impact and the utilization of the choice of using blood quantum to control and define who is Indigenous or who is native to this place. Because in reality, it is the tribes themselves who should be able to identify who their members are, their citizens are, and then be able to tell the United States government in that relationship. But the way that the services and the quote unquote benefits, and I put those in quotes on purpose, the benefits that the United States shares with the Indigenous people of this place really are responsibilities they owe us. And it's our people who should be defining for ourselves who we are and working that relationship in that manner. But the way that it has been utilized has been a way to not only identify and control, but also diminish our population, diminish who we are, and by diminishing us, also diminish our claims to land and their trust responsibility, which is a trust responsibility in perpetuity. But it will diminish if there are less people. It will go away if there are less people that they owe this trust responsibility to. So when I think about what blood quantum has been, I think about it as a tool that the United States has utilized as a part of its colonial approach to our Native peoples in this country, and is something that has continued to be utilized in Alaska. And we see it showing up in federal legislation that still impacts us all today, right? Obviously, ANCSA and the Marine Mammal Protection Act are two of the big pieces of federal legislation that we know have really big impacts on who we are. On one hand, it constrains who can be seen as a Native for purposes of different programs and services or shareholder status. On the other, it actually criminalizes us for hunting marine mammals. So it is not just a legal term of art now, it is actually something that our people have to live with as a part of their identity in order to even live our ways of life and practice our ways of life. And so for me, when I think about how it has been brought in and how it continues to be used, I think about that as a control mechanism and a diminishment mechanism against our Native peoples.
Guyana, thank you for that background. Crystal, Marie, do you guys have anything to add on that one? No? Okay. So my next question, what are the ways blood quantum is being utilized in Alaska Native tribes and organizations? What are ways in these organizations do we utilize blood quantum as, you know, a requirement, or what are some examples of utilizing blood quantum? Crystal?
So with my background in child welfare, a lot of the ways specifically in order to be a member of a tribe in our region, each tribe has different requirements. And for example, I won't name any specific tribes, for the sake of the discussion. For example, a tribe may have a 1/2 or maybe a quarter requirement to prove native blood in order to be a member of said tribe, and or that there may be other requirements. If a child does not meet those requirements and is at risk of being removed or is removed by the state welfare agencies, for example, in the state of Alaska is OCS, that child now it's not looked at as an ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, special requirements in working with that case, and therefore the case will be treated not as a native. They won't have the special ICWA requirements. And that's really devastating. It's really devastating to the entire family, to the, where you could literally lose tribal members as children because they don't meet that requirement of whatever the percentage needed for tribal enrollment.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd like to add, Mary?
She covered it. Tribal memberships, yeah.
Hmm.
And there are other being utilized in organizations. There are our Native corporations that may have a requirement to prove level of blood quantum in order to transfer shares, gift shares, be eligible for certain programs, and that has a direct impact on quality of life. It takes money to live, and because you cannot prove or provide your blood quantum, you don't qualify for a lot of programs that are developed and are available for people who fit into those categories, which is also devastating to families and people in the region.
Mhm.
Those are some great examples, Crystal. We have been recently in some discussions regarding blood quantum, and those are two wonderful examples that I think aren't very out in public, especially when it comes to ICWA. That can have a huge effect on our youth, our families, and the ability to keep our kids within our own tribal communities.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Are there any more discussion regarding utilization of blood quantum?
This is Logan. I would just say thank you to Crystal for sharing that, because the impacts around ICWA are so critical. And as we know, there's already a case going before the Supreme Court that really specifies this issue in a important way, and that is because of the way that our tribes may still have the BIA template constitutions if they're an IRA tribe, and they may not have had the constitutional shifts within the tribe to decide if they want to keep blood quantum or if they want to move to descendancy or some other way of defining tribal citizenship. The way these things can get tied up is, like this case that's happening in the Supreme Court, which is an ICWA case where a non-native family wanted to adopt a native child. Right away, as Crystal was sharing, the definition of that native child is going to be really framed around whether that child is enrolled in their tribe. And if that child is doesn't meet the blood quantum requirements, then ICWA wouldn't even apply, as she shared. But in this instance of this case, this is a Native child, and this case going between the Supreme Court is going to decide on the legality of the entire act, of the Indian Child Welfare Act itself. But it's also going to address, if the court chooses, and they most likely will choose to address, whether laws like this are based on our race as Native people or on our protected political status as Native people. And enrollment in a tribe is one of the ways that we show a protected political status. And that protected political status is really important because it allows us to make sure that we have that special government to government relationship, and the trust responsibility is intact with the federal government. If that goes away through this case, if that is reduced or diminished or even goes fully away, then all of the things that we know as Native people that are made specifically for Native people because of this relationship to the United States will go away. So everything will be threatened. Now, luckily, blood quantum is not the specific issue in the case itself. But you can see the direct tie between making sure that our children are enrolled in our tribes to impacting this relationship we have with the federal government. So it's beyond just ICWA, because if that protected political status for our people gets diminished and we are only subject to kind of a race-based approach by the federal government, then ANCSA itself, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, ANILCA, ICWA, all the education funding, all of those things are going to be suspect under federal law. So it's a really critical question. How do we take care of our children? One of the ways we do that is by enrolling them in their tribe. And if we can't enroll them in their tribe because of these blood quantum restrictions, then we have some serious challenges ahead of us. So I just wanted to thank you, Crystal, for sharing that.
Koyana, Longane, maybe can I jump in with a follow-up question, Shanita? Thank you. Koyana, I'm Alicia. Thank you to everyone for joining us on the call. Longane, you were really reminding me of some of the research that I think Shanita has done and brought to us around this connection of federal policy, just what you started with, the connection with federal policy and our tribal relationships with the federal government, and that is in fact the basis for these blood quantum. Even the language of blood quantum itself, I read, was the term blood is actually an Anglo-Saxon term that was more about the ancestry that they used to determine like royal bloodlines. Like that was the frame in which that then got transported across the ocean. So when they were setting up the United States, that language of blood was what was brought over. But I'm really curious about what you were saying around the tribes and this connections, because I think that there was a connection to the Dawes Act in terms of enrollment when blood quantum came even more important. I was just curious if you knew anything about that.
Gosh, cobwebs here in terms of the Dawes Act.
I'm really digging out your history lessons. Talk about the Dawes Act, Luckney.
So funny. And you know what, it came up in another conversation recently too. Well, I think that's really kind of where I was going with the conversation around the Indian Reorganization Act and kind of, you know, how that kind of impacted the way that came about and how a lot of our tribes have ended up with blood quantum as a requirement for enrollment. Because, you know, that was part of the, okay, who are the natives, right? The federal government was trying to figure out who are the Native people, who do we owe this trust responsibility to? And also, of course, you know, how does that, at what point will we no longer have this responsibility? right? So think about it as part of a termination act or termination policy era endeavor, where they have an ability to reduce us out of existence, which was the goal of the United States. Once they started kind of moving into our territories. Originally, the United States treated us as sovereign and separate governments. And even in the US Constitution, it acknowledges that. Now, the way the Supreme Court has, of course, interpreted that is to call us domestic dependent nations, which then puts us in this kind of weird relationship with the United States, where we have both our sovereignty, but also the United States government has this trust responsibility to us. And so through the Dawes Act, through the IRA, we're seeing a way for that to be kind of that data to be collected, that information to be known, and then a way for us to see down the road how quickly we will actually lose our native quote unquote status with the federal government through a blood quantum process. And
the
that
intention and the purpose was not inclusion, but to diminish the tribes like out of existence, is what I hear you saying.
well, yeah, because if the tribes don't exist, then they don't owe a trust responsibility. Then they can own all that land without any strings attached. And that has been the history of this country and the colonial process in this country. So they're not trying to, by using blood quantum, they weren't trying to offer us something good. By using blood quantum, they were figuring out a way to, one, control us, track us, and then be able to diminish us down so that eventually they would not have this trust responsibility to us and to our tribes any longer. So as a tool, it's kind of done what it was meant to do. But now we're at a different place in where we are as Native people to be able to define for ourselves who we are once again and what that means to us within our tribes, for our corporations, to work through these processes around the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We're the ones that need to be really driving this. We have the opportunity now as well in a couple different areas to be having these really critical conversations, but they're hard. They're hard conversations because oftentimes people's identity as who they are as Native people is kind of tied up in all of these different structures that now are supposed to be defining us, when from the very beginning of our inherent birth right as Native people, from our very beginning, we were born in as Native people. And so all these other structures are messing with that identity. And so it can be very personal. And some folks can get really defensive about it because it can really hurt who they are, commingled with all the other components of the colonial process that have worked to diminish our identity as Native people as well, and assimilate us. So these things are not just all by themselves, they're all working together, right? So that's how I think about that.
You know, another area where they really pushed for blood quantum was in the healthcare field. They wanted the tribes to, there was a big push to do tribal enrollment with quarter blood in order to get health care. And that was during the health compacting time. So in order to get services, we had to have that card, the tribal membership card, to prove we are Native.
And
Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you to Marie for saying that too, because that's really, that was one of the areas that was a really critical place, because that was literally life and death. If you had a quarter blood, you could get these services. If you didn't, you weren't able to, not through the Indian Health Service at least. But even in that space, we've seen massive transformation, because now the IHS eligibility rules for service have shifted so much so that they have a very broad approach to who is eligible and how you can determine if they're eligible to receive receive services as a Native person. And I've heard of different entities that have actually looked at how the IHS has expanded it because of the tribal advocates within the health system that made that possible.
Guyana, thank you. And with that discussion in mind, Lagane, I wanted to ask you some specific questions regarding Sea Alaska. So Sea Alaska recently dropped the requirement of blood quantum when it comes to enrolling new shareholders. Can you tell us a little more background about that, and what does that mean for Sea Alaska shareholders?
Sure. So we, the 1991 amendments that we're all familiar with made it possible for this change to happen. At the time that Sea Alaska created the elder shares and then the descendancy stock. At that time, Sea Alaska did not change the quarter blood quantum requirement that came from the original act itself, the original passage of ANCSA. They felt at the time that to even get the additional elder stocks and the descendancy stocks passed, that they just needed to focus on that and not the other issues that might be associated with it. And so that's the process they went on originally. But the language was already there in those 1991 amendments that would allow for us to have brought in our descendants and drop the blood quarter requirement. So in order for us to do this past year, Sea Alaska didn't have to have a federal amendment happen, right? It's already possible under the 91 amendments. What we did was we just activated that space of eliminating the quarter blood quantum requirement for descendants. And that was the vote that was put before our shareholders this year. And it passed by our voting shareholders. Which means that now you no longer, if you have lineal descent, you no longer need to also have a quarter blood quantum in order to receive those shares. There was a lot of discussion at the board level before we made a decision to move in this direction. And there was a lot of discussion afterwards, especially by our shareholders, trying to understand what the ramifications of this decision would look like from a number of different angles. And ultimately the change was passed and made. So it's effective as soon as the annual meeting started. The application period essentially opened, and there was already people lined up ready with their documents to submit everything they needed to be able to enroll as descendants. And it's pretty amazing to see that process unfold.
I could imagine that was extremely emotional for those people being able to enroll. Did you hear any feedback from them on that change and being able to enroll within the corporation and how it made them feel as a Native person?
Yeah, actually, I've had a couple different people share some stories with me about how it's impacted them. I'll share one that really just touched my heart, though. A young man who's been going to school out on the East Coast, who comes from a Native family from our region, of course. He was ready. If this passed, he was ready. And as soon as it passed, I think he was like, I don't know, one of the first 10 that got their documents in as soon as the portal opened up. And the folks in our shareholder office, goodness, have been processing them really quickly. So the turnaround has been pretty fast. Once they get all their documents in, a few days go by and all of a sudden they're a shareholder. And for this young man, it changed his life. He was going to school on the East Coast. He started reading all about our businesses and the focus areas of See Alaska's work. He started asking questions of his family. He has decided to move back to Alaska, complete his education here, and he wants to contribute back to our community. He wants to make a difference for our people. Up until this happened, he did not have that connection, he did not have that drive, and he did not have that interest. And so it was a really, really touching story to hear, because of course, we always want our family to come back home. And so hopefully his family will be enjoying his presence when he's able to finally move back home. But there's so many stories like that that have been happening. And I've been hearing from others who are hearing these stories as well. And it's just really moving.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very, I guess, very touching to hear those like personal stories for people. I think it can help make it a possible reality for others. Like, you know, this can happen. One thing I had been thinking of, and I have been looking into with blood quantum, is how we traditionally defined who was a tribal member. And I know with a lot of our cultures, you know, they're not written, a lot of it's orally passed down. But my grandma was Cherokee. And so I've been doing a lot of research regarding her side and our lineal side on Cherokee. And for becoming a Cherokee tribal member prior to blood quantum requirements, anybody could be a tribal member as long as they adopted the culture and followed the rules. And I'm wondering if you guys have heard anything similar with our tribes up here in Alaska. I know there was a lot of movement between our communities, and I would assume, you know, people would get taken in and become part of that community.
You know, Togiak has a mix of folks. We have different races, and our grandparents have welcomed each one, and they don't ever mention the color of their skin. They don't mention, you know, how different they are. They're just welcomed and loved as they are. But more recently, I've heard, you know, the color of their skin being mentioned, or that they're different. But with our elders, everyone was loved. So,
Mm.
Human beings like us.
Yeah. Guyana, thank you. And so, Lagane, I wanted to ask you, do you have any words of advice or encouragement to other ANCs, other Alaska Native corporations that are having these discussions and looking into potentially removing their blood quantum requirement for descendant enrollment? Is there any advice or words you would like to share in going through that process?
You know, I think it's really important for people to go into this eyes wide open. I feel like maybe I was I don't want to say I was naive about how this might be received as we moved through it. But I would say I was taken aback by a few different things. So I feel like if people are going to go into this this work, to be really wide open and one, I think it would be really good to do some trauma-informed training with all of our communities, because I feel like I mentioned earlier, this notion of the connection to our identity can be really painful for people, especially for people who don't feel like they are Native enough already. And it can be very jarring and very painful for people who have already been disconnected, who may not really know who their family is, may not really have solid relationships, um, that this may be something that causes our people even further harm. You know, if we don't talk about it in a good way, and if we don't go into it eyes wide open and make space for the ways that people are going to show up to the conversation. We had a lot of conversation in our community about this, and um, there's people who have feelings all over the place. Some people are really against it, and only see the bad in it, and then some people are only for it, and they only see like why this is going to be good. And so you have to kind of traverse between those two places and acknowledging the truth that happens, while also talking about what is the long-term benefit. And it's our corporations for sure, and See Alaska did that, but also our tribes are also on this path. As was mentioned earlier, some tribes still have a blood quantum requirement. And so going into the conversation, I was really supportive right from the jump, because I understand what a hurtful and harmful tool blood quantum has been for the whole history of this country towards Indigenous people and what its true purpose is. So my interest is let's move away from that as soon as possible. We don't want that or need that to be controlling our identity. But it's been so entangled now with so many different parts of the structures that we have to deal with, that it does have an impact on each of us in different ways. Um, the other is, you have to talk about the reality of the impact to for the corporation specifically, right? It's going to reduce the amount of dividend funds that get dispersed because you're going to have more shareholders now, right? So you have to talk about that reality, and you have to talk about that reality as balanced with, and here's the other things that are going to happen because of it, in terms of, the long-term reasoning behind why you'd go in this direction. I'll share my long-term reasoning for supporting that, if that would be okay. When I think about the 1991 amendments and the effort, the fight that our leaders at that time had to put in, I think about what they were protecting us from. They were protecting us from, and this is this is much earlier. This is like what, 15, 20 years earlier. After the legislation, original ANCSA, was passed, it was pretty quickly after that our leaders realized that what was baked into it, that ANCSA could go public in 1991, was going to be devastating for us. So our leaders at the time recognized that going public with our shares for our corporations was going to divest us of the 44 million acres that we were allowed to hold on to out of the how many million of acres here in Alaska. They saw that then. They had a long-term vision of impact, and they had to work really hard and come together to figure out a pathway forward. That's what became the 91 amendments. Now, it didn't stop that necessarily from happening, but it did make it possible for the control of that decision to be made by the shareholders. So we, as corporations, as shareholders in our corporations, we have the ability to we have the ability to make a decision if we want to go public or not. 50% plus, right? If a majority of our shareholders want to go public, the law allows us to do that. And now as it was then, that would devastate our corporations. We would lose control of our corporations, right? Well, what distinguishes who we are as Native people in making that type of decision? For me, I was thinking about what we need to know about who we are and the connection we have to our homelands in order to understand that ANCSA was never about the corporate structure for us. ANCSA was always about our homelands. The reason we went into this whole arrangement is because we were trying to hold on to our homelands. And so now that we are where we are, the more people that we have that are disconnected from who they are, who don't know who they are, who don't feel a responsibility to our homelands, but rather perhaps are really, well educated and really business minded and really economically savvy folks, then they're going to start weighing, what makes most sense. Does it make sense for us to continue to be these private corporations, or should we go public with the potential of making more money? So how are we going to make sure that our people are always connected to who they are and that they understand the responsibility they have to our homelands, so that potential day of when over half of our shareholders are talking about going public, that day will never happen. Now, the only way that I can think of to ensure that doesn't happen is to make sure that our people know who they are. And if they don't know who they are, then we lose the ability to have them helping take care of our corporations, which are the containers that hold the private land interest that we were able to keep through the ANCSA process. And so when I think about this, I'm not thinking about what's happening in the short term. I'm thinking about what's going to happen in 15, 20, 25 years down the road. So when I think about, the purposes of eliminating blood quantum, it's because I want our people to know who they are, to feel cherished by us, to feel welcome to come home, to put their feet on our homelands, to get out on our oceans, to engage in our cultural practices, to learn our language, so that these can in fact be and continue to be Alaskan Native corporations, not just a corporation who pays a dividend to its shareholders. So for me, that's where my heart and my mind were when I was thinking about supporting this initiative to drop the blood quantum requirement for our descendants. And there's other people have different reasons. And I think also that the impacts, the shorter term impacts to our people is something we also have to consider, because it does diminish the amount of the dividends that come through. And so that's a real conversation that has to happen. But for our corporation, when they created those additional elder shares, each elder, when they turn that 65, they get an additional 100 shares, right? So that was one of the ways to help kind of continue to support and kind of diminish that impact at the time. So those are, some of the considerations that are out there, and also the reason why I felt so strongly that we needed to address this issue now.
Thank you, Logane. Crystal, do you have anything to add?
No, I really appreciate Lagane's perspective. I completely agree. Completely agree with it. From my own perspective, I was adopted, so to quantify or to put on paper how much blood quantum I have, my children now wouldn't be considered Native, compared to if I went off of the documentation of my birth certificate, my biological mother's birth certificate, and my children. And so they wouldn't, so my kids or my grandkids, in my generation, not even 20, 25 years from now, like right now, today, a whole generation would be not eligible or recognized. And as a Native person, that's something that we work on daily, within our own family, but with across the region. That's something that that's like the missing piece, is identifying, loving, acknowledging, and healing of who we are as Native people. And it's like all these things are happening around us all the time, and having that path to healing, but understanding is so critical in this, like today, like right now. And looking forward, what is it going to look like in 5, 10, 20 years, when I'm an elder ancestor. I would like to identify and organize, like we have to change it up a little bit, not discrediting the people who came before us and what they set up, but we really have to take a look at how we're providing those services, as well as healing and making it better when we aren't here anymore, and not just getting a big dividend. Money is essential, but that's, like she said, that's not what we're here for. That's not what our corporations are for. I'll stop. I could talk all day about stuff.
Thank you, Crystal. Marie, do you have any remarks?
Mm-mm.
Okay. Alrighty. Well, so with that conversation, is there anything from Alicia, Kay? I want to make sure that you guys are included.
Thanks. Koyana, Crystal, I just wanted to really hold you up as a leader in our region, who I know is really passionate about this topic. And I think I have heard you speak about it before, as just continuing to draw attention to it. So when you were saying how important it is for identity and healing work, I really want to acknowledge all of your work around it and say that, Koyana, and I feel like we're catching up with you in a conversation that you've been having in our region and bringing to our leadership. So thank you for that work. I know you're super passionate about it. Lagini, you said something that I thought was super interesting, because it kind of turns a concern that I have heard maybe on its head, which is this concept of, if corporations were to eliminate a blood quantum requirement, the concern that I've heard before is that it's going to make us less Native, right? Based on blood quantum, that incorporating people who have I was trying to think, it's a smaller fraction or it's a bigger fraction. A smaller fraction, my math is not so good, but the smaller fraction is in some way going to dilute who we are as a Native corporation or as a people. And what I hear you saying and what Marie is saying is that our identity is not based on that. It never, in fact, was. And that by being inclusive, that's actually how we're going to build ourselves as people, which I think is just so powerful. And I want you to say it again, because that's really, really interesting to me. And I loved how you framed that.
Yeah, goodness sheesh. And I would say that while I share that framing, I can't take ownership of it, because that's actually coming from our own people. You know, my grandparents, my great grandparents, our clan leadership, you know, where I'm from, we've always had a process of adoption. Um, and it's a really specific way of bringing people in. And it has been one of the best parts of our family. You know, we have adopted uncles and aunties and sisters and brothers and grandchildren. It makes us stronger. They make us stronger. Um, and so when I think about the way that, you know, our current identity might be impacted by the dropping of blood quantum, I also want to recognize that a lot of our people have, you know, have a lot tied up in what that means. And on purpose, you know, this structure was created on purpose to diminish us. And as a result of that, you have you know, you have people who are kind of getting pushed out of being included, and then you have people who you know, are still grappling with what does it mean to be Native in relationship to these corporate structures, these tribal structures, you know, to our cultural practices. And so it's this real um it's a real place of uh confusion, I think, as well, when we aren't really clear about what we mean. And when we define who we are as Native people, we don't define ourselves by, I'm a quarter this, I'm a half that. That was never part of our identity structure. You know, if I look to our clan system and my ancestors' wisdom for how they viewed our people, we were matrilineal. And so you always followed your mother's line. And when you are outside of that space where your mother comes from, say outside of your clan system, they had a process to adopt the mother into the opposite clan of the father, so that the children would always have a clan. They would always know who they are and who they belong to. And you still have, even today, even if you have a non-Native mother and your father is Native, you will always be the child of your father's clan. It doesn't mean that you're that clan. It means you're the child of that clan. You're the grandchild of that clan, which means that clan has responsibilities to holding you up and taking care of you and loving you up. And so there's always a tie back to who we are as Native people. And when we think about that, and we think about how do we progress the ways that our people viewed identity through our structures that we have, rather than trying to keep adapting and changing with this blood quantum designation that doesn't even come from our people. You know, I'm excited for what that identity transformation will look like as we continue to say, if you are Native, we don't care what percentage Native you are. That's not something that's coming from us. What we care about is, are you contributing to your community? Are you learning your language? Are you practicing your cultural ways? Are you going home? Are you fighting for our ways of life? Are you holding up our elders? Are you respecting our community? Are you making sure that you're bringing your children home? These are the ways that we think about what it means to be Native. And that's 100%, right? It's 100% of practicing who we are culturally with relevance to who we are, and doesn't have anything to do with this outside construct of blood quantum.
Well, I just want to say thank you for that. I really think that going forward and defining who we are in our own identity, like you just said, is the best step forward. And I'm so thankful that See Alaska took that step for us, that first hard step. And hopefully we can start having these discussions throughout Alaska in our communities, and specifically for me, Bristol Bay, because that's where my home is. And I really want to see us build our people up and bring them together. And blood quantum is such a divisive tool. And, you know, we're already pretty small. We need to band together and accept everybody. So Koyana, so much for this knowledge you guys imparted and taking the time. Very
Okay.
important.
Can I say something, Kay? Because you said something really important there.
Mhm.
You know, by way of the census, which has all kinds of problems, so caveat. Alaska Native people today, we're like how much of the population of Alaska? We're like 177,000 people total. You know, prior to colonization, we were in the hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions, depending on who you talk to and how they conceive of their people. Because of course, we're all such diverse, distinct societies of people, right? So think about our population now. Like we as Native people should be invested in having more Native people, not less. Because not only is it good for us to have our numbers strengthened to bring back more of our ancestors, this is how, at least for our Tlingit and Haida people, this is how we bring our ancestors back, is by having more Native people carry their names, right? And so how do we bring our people back? How do we restore ourselves? And, you know, at such a small population, just in terms of the numbers, we're at risk. We're at risk as a population. We're getting diminished, which is, you know, the whole point of it from the beginning anyway. Like, why would we want to be complicit in that? Like, I want to see that number at 300,000. I want to see that number at 500,000. You know, I want to see that number getting us higher, and making sure that those people know who they are and are responsible to our communities and are stewards of our homelands and are giving back, not just taking. I want people who know who they are, connected to our people and loving us. We're lovable, gosh darn it.
And we have the best humor. I mean, come on,
Yeah.
Native people love to laugh. Well, before we sign off, because we do have a little bit of time, we can open it up for questions. If you guys would like to type your questions in the chat or come off mute, because I see some people are on phones. It may be a bit easier. Please feel free. We'll wait for a few minutes to see if we have any.
I'd just like to make a comment. My name is Ingrid Hansen, and Alicia is my daughter. Hi.
Thank
I
you.
was-
We love her.
I'm so glad. One of the things that has always bothered me about the decision to force an expression of tribal community into the corporate structure. I mean, quantum was one phenomena that brought us into the difficulties we're in right now. And the different problems that are faced by having a corporate structure enfold a tribal community is almost, I think, even worse, because the tribal community was successful and natural and part of how we lived. And corporate culture does not have the flexibility and the responsiveness that we had before. And so it is a reflection of the pressures that our people who were negotiating ANCSCA faced. Well, what are we going to have? I mean, do we really want tribal reservations? Everybody agreed, and I agree. No, we don't want that either. We want to be in charge of our destiny and our money. Well, then you have to have shareholders. Well, how do you get and keep those shareholders? And so blood quantum was the tool. Was it a good tool? Well, you can see the shortcomings that we're experiencing right now. And I appreciated hearing a little bit about the population and the diminishing population that the ANCSCA corporations in Alaska are facing right now. We knew this was going to happen. It was woven part and parcel into the ANCSCA agreement that we would have these population difficulties, mostly because the diminishment that came to Alaska from the Russians of our population and the dreadful, horrible slavery and diseases. But then more came with the Americans, who, remember, when they came, they had just finished the Civil War. And so many people who were in authority believed deeply in a racist understanding of everyone who wasn't either a man or white, or pretended to be a man who may or may not have been white, such as my paternal grandpa. But anyhow, you get into ancestry. But the thing that I wanted to say is that I think that moving into a different consideration, which was in the 1991 documents, I surprised Alicia by reading her the portion of the law that was passed in Congress saying that blood quantum is not the only way to consider who a shareholder is. You could determine another way, other criterias. So go forth and use this feature, I said to Alicia. And why aren't we already doing it? Me, I'm 69. I'm not going to last forever. Let's get this problem solved. The other thing that I want you to think about is what happened to the poor people who signed on to the 13th region. There's a bunch of natives there who probably would love to come home. My mother's sister's family in California, for instance, and there are many, many more. They already have ties. There already are relatives. And the 13th was facing difficulties from the get-go because they didn't have access to the land or to the royalties that could have continued an income stream. So making the 13th increase the burden. I mean, many of the early corporations, including Bristol Bay, barely survived their infancy. And kudos to everyone in Bristol Bay leadership who made it so successful. I am so happy. But I think we have a big tent. Let's get those people home. So there's my soapbox. I have more if you want.
Thanks, Mom. So good.
No problem. I got a zillion of them. I just had my book group meeting, read the book and discuss the book last night here at my house on Hearth in the Snow. They had really interesting comments. It was great.
I see Beverly has her hand up.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Beverly Cloud. I'm a BBNC shareholder. We also have a village corporation. And one of the ways that we've used the corporate structure to meet the needs of our lineal descendants is to form a nonprofit, of which I'm the chairman. We set aside monies and we have an enrollment process for our shareholders to enroll their lineal descendants. And those descendants will be eligible for benefits that we've identified. And I think it's just really important, that BBNC as a leader of our, we always have been told that we're separate from BBNC, which we are, but I do remember that a survey came out and a majority of shareholders wanted a blood quantum for adding new shareholders. I think each area has to identify for themselves what they want to do. For instance, our tribe in their constitution allows for lineal descendants to be tribal members. And I'm just going to suggest this kind of a radical idea because it does pertain to our sovereignty. And that is, stop using blood quantum, use tribal membership. And that should be enough. I mean, I've gone up to TSA. I have a tribal membership card. That is it's a federally recognized ID, and TSA agents don't even know what to do with it. But to digress back to the whole idea of blood quantum, it needs to be obliterated. You guys have covered the emotional reasons, the financial, there's financial reasons, but truly, I totally agree with Ms. Medicine Crow. We need to increase our population, a recognizable population, and we need to be very active in it. Like I mentioned, we are enrolling our descendants or lineal descendants into our nonprofit so they can become eligible for benefits. And it's a confusing topic for our shareholders to talk about. So there needs to be that education. People need to start thinking about why is a tribe separate from a corporation, of a regional and a village corporation, and it's just an educational process, and I'm really happy. Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss this topic.
Thank you, Glenna, Beverly, good to see you. I wonder, Lakane, if you had any, I think that there was an education component to See Alaska's work and talking broadly to the shareholder base. How did that education kind of roll out? I'm just curious. And how quick was it? Was it over time?
Well, the See Alaska staff conducted a survey. There wasn't a decision yet about what was going to happen, but the conversation was starting, and they put out a survey to our shareholders just to get their thoughts back. So that was really helpful and instructive. There was lots of folks who supported, and there was folks who didn't support it and shared their reasoning for it. Really helpful insight to understand, what people's concerns were, but also why people supported it. And then they crafted the, from that work and thinking about, how we were going to move forward, right? Once that decision was made, they were able to then kind of really respond to, in the communications, what they heard from folks in the survey, which I thought was really, really good, because they're utilizing the knowledge that our people were sharing with them to get a better understanding of what was at the heart of this for so many folks. So I think that was helpful. The other piece that I had more of a role in, I guess, as any of our directors did, was our community meetings that happened before the annual meeting, and talking about the pros and cons of passage of this removal of blood quantum for our descendants. And it was really important in those discussions to be able to share why we supported it, but also give some time and space for kind of talking about the cons that we had heard as well, and that some of our directors were able to kind of give voice to, so that it would help inform everyone who was listening and help them come to their own decision. And that was something that I shared as well when I had a chance to speak on this at one of the community meetings. I said, in this space, while I serve on the board, and we passed this to bring forward to the shareholders, you are ultimately the ones that will make this decision. And in this space, I'm just like all of you, right? Like, we're just shareholders trying to make the best decision we can on how we're going to vote our shares. And so the real decision makers on this issue were our shareholders. They were the ones that had the opportunity to decide which direction we'd go. And understanding that is also, I think, really important, because these types of decisions are corporate wide. They have impact across the board. And as a result, we're already seeing shifts. We already have, like I said, we already have so many people signing up and enrolling our descendants who didn't have that blood quantum eligibility, but were eligible by every other means because they're Native and they're from here and their families from here, and they can show that linkage to this area. So I would say that it's a lot of communication. And I think people have to be open to talking about things without taking things personally. And that's hard, as you all know. That's a hard space to be in. And also because we were doing this during the pandemic, it's hard to only have these conversations virtually. So I was really grateful that we did have some in-person community meetings.
Thank you, Lagane, for that. I just want to thank you guys for all your knowledge. And looking at the time, I want to ask one final question to the three of you. And so, do you have any closing remarks or something that you would like to leave with our listeners to think about while they're listening to this session and learning? Is there anything that you would like our listeners to maybe chew on for later, or and then I'll give it to Crystal or Marie, whoever wants to go.
I would defer to my elder Marie to go first.
I think our people need to belong. We've recognized that in years past, and we still can feel it today. They need a sense of belonging. They don't need to be left out. So I think it's time that we embrace them and love them and teach them who they are, who they really are.
Diana. Crystal?
I would want people to What was the question again? Sorry.
The question is any closing remarks or something you want to leave the listeners with to either think about, carry with them through the day, good advice, loving words, something to chew on for later, something to get their brains going about this topic.
All right. I always think of it as an elevator speech, like what can you say in 2 minutes? So I would say, having space to talk about these issues, specifically, blood quantum, and as was talked about earlier, that some people, it's so intertwined in who they are as a Native person. Like I've spoken to people and they're like, well, I'm 3/4 or I'm 5/8 or whatever, and like very proud of that. And so no matter where people are at when having those conversations, just being there to listen, and also to help guide and to teach and educate. So I used to be very proud of my percentage. I calculated it out, with my bio parents, and I was hot stuff, like I'm this many percentage until I learned a different way. And so I have a completely different outlook on that. So I know people are, we always want to do the right thing. We want our people to be healthy and happy. I mean, you could ask anyone, would you rather have a bigger dividend or would you want to be healthy? Would you want our family and our people to be healthy? 100% people are going to say we want healthy people. And just to really listen. So, and this is something that I'm working on, is when people are having a conversation with you, we listen to respond rather than like just really listening to what the person is saying and where they're coming from, and just being okay with that. And sometimes it's really uncomfortable when having a discussion, people, it's very different than yours. But just being that gentle guide of the importance of getting rid of this and really working towards inclusion of all people, because there's people who aren't able, maybe they're adopted and they have no connection, but they know their great grandma was a tribal member. Like there's so many people who are left out, and we really need to be inclusive of that. Because if we continue on this trajectory, it's not a good one. We are literally extincting, genociding ourselves. And so when we know better, we do better. And just being really open to things that may not go along with how you thought. And sometimes maybe it's information coming from your kiddo who's in elementary school who's learning a different thing. I mean, we learn things from all people, and they're not always older or us. We can learn. We're always learning. And I know, I just wanted to say Shanita is my daughter and I learn from her. I learn from my kids every day. So I really appreciate, and I'm very, very proud.
Guyana, thank you. What about you, Liz? Do you have any closing remarks or something that you'd like to leave with folks?
Yeah. I just really want to say Gunashtishawa for inviting me and letting me share some of my thoughts. And I just encourage anyone who's interested in having this discussion to reach out. I know that some of our staff at See Alaska would probably also be really willing to share some of the things that they did and created and all of those things. So I hope that your folks have a chance to connect up with them. I'm sure it's probably already happened. But at the end of the day, when we think about who we are as Native people, I hope that it is our cultural knowledge systems and ways of being and our cultural values that drive our understanding of identity, and that we can put that to work for us, and that we can say that these external control mechanisms over Native people that don't come from us no longer serve us. Like, they were there before, and now we can say goodbye to them, and we can enact what we feel is the best for our people. And to me, this is not only advancing our own self-determination, but it's really living into the dreams that our ancestors have always had for us, and a responsibility that we have for our own people. And not just to our own people, to this land, because we owe that same responsibility to our homelands. So I'm just looking forward to the day that we can continue to push through these really challenging discussions. We can't skip them. We know we have to have them, but to be able to kind of keep moving towards that vision. And again, reach out, and I'm happy to share with others as well, or answer any more questions if I can. Ms. Chishawa.
Guyana, thank you. Alicia, Kay, is there any closing remarks? No?
Just that we will be sharing the recordings from Sarssa Time. You can find them on our social media once we get those posted, hopefully in the next week or so. And don't forget, if you don't get our emails, to send us an email at bbncef@bbnc.net, and we will add you onto that listserv. So, Quiana, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Guyana, everyone who came here, and to our listeners who are listening. Thank you for taking the time and listening to this important discussion. I want to give a huge thank you, a huge Guyana, to our panelists, Marie-Paul, Lagane, Crystal. Thank you for taking the time and the time out of your busy schedules. So Guyana, thank you.